here. We're going to have the microphones and video off for everyone except the presenters during our presentation. Then we will put everyone back on video when it comes time for the question and answers.
Issue.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank you for joining the Center for Racial and Social Justice at Shaw University for our inaugural series of Learned Conversations. Before we get started further, I would like to remind everyone that we will have you on mute, and until the presentation is over, we will have videos off except for the presenters. So, I am Dr. Valerie Ann Johnson. I'm Dean of Arts, Sciences, and Humanities here at Shaw University, and I'm also the co-director of the Center for Racial and Social Justice. The other director is Dean Johnny Hill, who also is Dean of our School of Divinity. We profusely thank President Paulette Dillard and the IA team, Institutional Advancement, for providing us with the support in order to bring to you what I know will be a great program. You are in for a treat. I am delighted and pleased and honored to be able to introduce to you Ms. Elvatrice Belches. Ms. Belches is going to share with us her considerable findings regarding Leonard Medical School. Before we get into her presentation, I'd like to remind you that we will have question and answers, and those questions that you have, please put into the chat and we will answer them as time allows. I also would like for you to note, and I'm going to share my screen here with you, that not only do we have Leonard Medical School, but we have Leonard Medical School Hospital, which is now our Tyler Hall. This hospital was built in 1910, and the architect was a Black man, Gaston Alonzo Edwards, who taught at Shaw University and was able to be the first Black architect licensed in North Carolina. So not only do we have several firsts in terms of the medical school, but the medical school hospital, We have a connection to Black architecture in this state. And so, without any more introduction, I am pleased to start the conversation with Ms. Elvatrice Belches. And my first question to you has to do with, give us a little bit of who you are, and also let us know a little bit about how you started this journey. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that we can move into your wonderful presentation.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm a Richmond area resident and second generation Virginian. So this particular project is a passion project for me because all of my grandparents going back, back probably several hundred years, all migrated from North Carolina. So that's the ancestral home. So it's personal. I received my BA and MA from Hampton University and joined the faculty, not as an adjunct, but as a rank and file instructor at 24 years old, where I started to teach anatomy and physiology to registered, well, pre-registered nursing students and folks that would go on to become physicians and pharmacists, and also professors of education. So that was a powerful experience for me. You know, when you have your mentors become your colleagues, that's really a blessing. So I taught there full time for a while, and then I came back home to Richmond and matriculated at and graduated from the Medical College of Virginia's School of Pharmacy. So I practiced in hospital pharmacy as well as long-term care. My calling is as an educator. So whether I'm talking about the body or how medications work or history, it's all relative. How did I get from being a pharmacist to this? Glad you asked. Actually, I was called into it. So in 1999, I resigned my position as a full-time pharmacist. I didn't relinquish my license or anything to enter. Well, I knew I was called to tell our lesser known stories by way of documentaries and publications. So within a year, I was working on as an associate producer on the American Legacy television special and moving towards publishing historical articles, if you will. So that's how I got started in it. But my parents always shared stories with me that kept me interested in history. And so it is my calling. That calling has resulted in some interesting experiences. So I have been an archival researcher for over 25 years. I've worked on the documentaries of others, but I also have my documentaries in development. And one of those is this one, and a publication and telling those stories of those powerful Leonard men in both pharmacy and medicine. So that is my calling.
And I'm about to keep eating my honey book.
So in addition to that, one of the highlights of this journey in terms of documentaries and movies is being tapped to serve as the in-studio researcher on Steven Spielberg's Lincoln back in 2011. Believe it or not, I used every facet of my background, the anatomy and physiology as a college instructor, the pharmacy and the history, believe it or not. For an example, I had to field questions from virtually every department. So when they wanted to know what type of ammunition was used and what type of injuries the mini balls caused, for an example, I brought in mini balls from my Civil War mini balls from my own collection. And I brought in these really detailed atlases showing the really rough injuries that were caused. And so, you know, that was a very special experience, but I'll stop there. So I do have you know, I'm looking for backers, but I do have a long time project on the Leonard men, as I call them. And I look to bring that to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us that overview, because now I really want us to hear more about these amazing Leonard men, a little bit about who they are and how they came to be the men that they were, and what was their impact in thinking about how they had an impact on medicine in the United States, not just in their small circles. So start us off, please.
All right. The impact has been immense, and it still is immense. I have been blessed to conduct oral history interviews and film descendants who are third generation physicians. So what they did continues in terms of their contributions, not only their contributions in medicine, but in civil rights, organizational leadership, and also educational leadership. So I've just pulled a few examples today that speak to those things and a few more. So absolutely, when we it's a good time to talk about this because we're still in the midst of COVID, and we're always looking at social determinants as to why we have these disparities. Where they recognized those disparities over 100 years ago, and they sought to mitigate the effects of those disparities. Four of the biggest things that they've faced and we still face in terms of healthcare disparities are where you live, in terms of redlining the results of that, where you work, the ability to attain an education, and also, where you live in terms of the ability to get healthy food, if you will. People live in food deserts. And so, we're still battling those things, and there's still much work to be done, but we have powerful examples of how they sought to mitigate those effects, even over 100 years ago.
And we can remember that many of the doctors that you are talking about served during a pandemic themselves, during the time of influenza. And so we are repeating in some ways a past that we have had some that has really affected us in many ways, and that we have some experience with. So I think it now would be a good time to start showing some of the PowerPoint that you have so that we can see those faces.
All right. All right, as just a brief background, as most of you know, the Reverend Tupper founded Shaw University in around December of 1865. And as early as 1866, he started putting together a plan to start a medical school. It was quite evident to virtually all who, witnessed these things that the mortality rate for Blacks was much higher than whites. And so he sought to mitigate that. So he hatched a plan as early as 1866, and it came about a little later with the help of his brother-in-law, Judson Wade Leonard, and his family in funding money for that first dormitory, medical dormitory, and the medical building. Now here, what you're viewing now is an circa 1884 photograph of the Leonard Medical School faculty members. These men were physicians that were of the South. Many of them, or the majority of them, actually attended medical school in northern states, but they were dedicated to pouring into those early Leonard men, and they respect these men, and it's, that in itself is a powerful story.
Next slide, please.
All right, this is one of my favorite photographs because I believe it includes the majority of the student body as it relates to the medical school. And it's special because on the very first row, and I think someone may be cut off a little bit there, but on the very first row, let me go back a bit. In 1886, Leonard graduated its first 6 students. And those men are Hall of Famers in and of themselves. There was one, MSG Abbott, that ended up practicing in Florida. You have somewhat cut off here to my right, M.T. Pope. He was born free. You have A.T. Prince. You have James T. Williams. And actually, if you look in the very back there, you do see Aaron McDuffie Moore. These men were special, and it allows us to start to debunk some myths or things that we have assumed. Many of these men were AB men. What do we mean by that? It means that they had attended historically Black colleges prior to entering Leonard, right? And doing a deep dive into the archival research, I can tell you that if you look at this, the person that is second from the left on the first row, and we'll talk about him more a little later, you have Lawson Andrew Scruggs. He was a Virginian born in 1857. And you also have, as a member of the first class, MSG Abbott. Both of those men matriculated at the Richmond Theological Institute in Richmond prior to entering Shaw. And there are myriad examples like that. So again, sometimes we assume that, okay, they were coming out of enslavement and here they were, but you have quite a few of these men who actually earned bachelor's degrees prior to entering Shaw. And one of the things that I uncovered that I thought was interesting in that they were truly consecrated. They were, domestic missionaries, if you will, because both MSG Abbott and Mr. Scruggs were both licensed to preach prior to even coming to the medical school. So those are some of the interesting things. And, I've tracked them all over the country, from, Midwest, down to, from Texas, from Massachusetts to Florida. And their stories are really incredible. Now, I want to say this before I forget it. You have your archival, of course, research that you do with primary, secondary, tertiary documents. But some of the most powerful stories come from conducting oral history interviews. And I've been blessed to speak to even some sons and daughters, as well as grandsons and daughters of these Leonard men. And the stories are simply powerful. One of the men that I filmed maybe 4 or 5 years ago for the documentary was about 93 years old. And his father had graduated from the Leonard Medical School in 1897. And the stories are just simply incredible. One of the things that is important is you have to conduct oral history interviews because a lot of these things are not in any textbooks as of yet.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And tell us a little bit also about the photographs as you discuss the pictures, the photographs. Where did they come from? How did you get access to these photos?
Actually, through archival research and primary documents and photographs, as well as secondary locations. For an example, you have biographical dictionaries, and also some of them come from descendants themselves. So they're, to be a successful archival researcher, you really have to be ready to deal with repositories all over America. And it's such, that's just part of the job. And I'll tell you, the number one thing is prayer, because with prayer and hard work, there are things that people have not found yet, but the way that we digitize now, more and more things are coming to light. So you have, there are days where I will go through 3,000 pages of microfilm in order to find that one money shot or photograph. But, you just have to do your due diligence. But I pray first and then I go to work.
And you're reminding us that you're going to find materials in all different forms, not just digital, but you said microform, microfiche. A lot of times people haven't been taught how to even go through those kinds of records. So you have to also be able to read handwriting. And
Yes.
I know that is an awesome task to decipher handwriting from 100 years ago. So having abilities and multiple technologies is an important part of the work that you do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And whatever you do, you have to seek the counsel of the elders. That's a definite. And maintain a network of the elders, and they can steer you in places that people wouldn't even think to look look at or look for. So yes, it's a combination of things, but you have to sit at the feet of the elders in order to get our stories, because a lot of them really haven't been told, or they haven't seen the light of day as of yet. Absolutely.
So tell us some more. Let's see what else you have in the next slide, please.
All right. So now I want to take us into an overview of three main areas. Number one, the role of the Black hospital movement, organizational leadership, civil rights, and a couple of more things. So I start with Dr. Cornelius N. Garland. Now, Dr. Garland graduated in the class of 1901 at Charlotte University, but prior to that, he graduated from Livingston College. He was born in Alabama, and he actually started a hospital called the Plymouth Hospital. Now, let's stop here and talk about the Black hospital movement a little bit, because our Leonard men were huge in the Black hospital movement. First of all, we need to address why there was a Black hospital movement. Generally, historians point to Dr. Daniel Hale Williams and his founding of Providence Hospital in Chicago in about 1891. He also had a nurse's training school with that. So these men, as we will see, believed in lifting as they climbed. All right. So having said that, yes, our people could be seen in white-run hospitals, but those white-run hospitals, for the most part, did not allow Black doctors to join the staffs, if you will. Here in Richmond, for an example, prior to freedom, we had a Main Street hospital for slaves. We also had the Medical College of Virginia and Retreat Hospital that saw patients, but it was not uncommon, and this is what occurred here. If you were Black, you were seen in these damp, dark basement wards. All right, I've had a grandson of a Leonard doctor tell me that you could be a woman who had just given birth, and you were separated from someone who had active tuberculosis, perhaps by just a single hanging sheet. And that's no place to get well. So if you think about this, the Black hospital movement happened for several reasons. Number one, you could not staff those hospitals at the time. So our Black doctors could see our people to the door, but you did not have that continuum of the ability to take care of your patients. Number two, the Black hospital movement afforded our doctors the ability to continue to hone their surgical skills. If you learned, these surgical procedures at Howard or Meharry or Leonard, but you could not go or treat your patients in a hospital, it was akin to being all dressed up with nowhere to go. And thirdly, it was a source of race pride. You knew that you were going to be treated as a human being. And so those are just three of some of the major reasons why we had the Black hospital movement. So you cannot speak about the Black hospital movement without talking about the Leonard graduates. I have uncovered probably over 40 hospitals across America that had at least one Leonard grad. And for having graduated only over 400 physicians, almost 10% were founders. That's astounding. So back to Dr. Garland. Garland finished in 1901, and then he went over to London, where he was at, I believe, the Royal Hospital there, where he learned extensive or did a deep dive into surgical techniques with some of the best folks in the world. Now, we often think about these Leonard men as perhaps not specializing. Many of them specialized. So if you hear the fact that the majority of them were just primary physicians, that really isn't the case. And there's a reason for that we need to address now. Because of the exclusionary practices of some of the medical organizations, our Black doctors founded their own. We had the National Medical Association being founded in 1895. And you'll notice that we have the National Medical Association and we have the American Medical Association. We have the National Pharmaceutical Association and we have the American Pharmaceutical Association. We have the National Bar Association and the American Bar Association. There's a reason for that. Early on, you had these exclusionary practices with few exceptions, and there were exceptions. You could not join those, and so therein lies a catch-22. Because in order to take some of these specialty exams to become board certified, you had to first be a member of your local or state chapter. And so you will not find perhaps many of the Leonard men listed as being board certified, but you'll find among them some of the greatest and most brilliant surgeons that you can locate anywhere. So I wanted to get that across too. And the fact that the school stopped, fully in 1914 and became 2-year until 1918, that also, explains some of the reason why you won't see many of them as being listed as board certified, because they ended that program so early. But back to Dr. Garland, in order to mitigate again the effects of these healthcare disparities, after he studied for a year or so in England, he came back and he went up to Massachusetts, where he took the medical boards and did extremely well. And he set up practice, but he realized again, we needed places that where Blacks could be seen and where our Black nurses could be trained. So in 1918, if you'll go to the next slide, he founded the Plymouth Hospital. There's a Plymouth Hospital there. I believe it was on 12 Spring Street in Boston, Massachusetts. And I mean, he had an operating room there, a nurses training school, because if I remember correctly, I don't think there was a single place where Black nurses could train in that area. So again, he understood the need for that lifting as we climb. And you will find nurses training schools attached to several of the hospitals founded by Black doctors. So this again is Boston, Massachusetts. Next slide. So I wanted to show everyone, so this is circa 1910, some of the nurses in the nurses training school of the Plymouth Hospital. Again, they did not discriminate. They didn't simply treat people at the hospital. They went out and did house calls for both Black and white patients.
And you'll notice that in 1910 was also when Leonard Medical School Hospital was built. So there was a considerable movement around getting the facilities built for Black people.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, Dean Johnson, because we need to mention briefly that Flexner report. Oftentimes people, if they're outside of the state of North Carolina, they may not know a lot about Leonard, but they know that it was a defunct medical school, and they may have heard that the Flexner report, contributed to its demise. Well, when Abraham Flexner made his rounds in around 1909 and 1910 or so, he did state that he thought only 2 Black medical schools were worthy of remaining open, and that was Meharry and Howard. And I believe he was, if I remember correctly, he was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation. Now, if you look at that beautiful hospital building that still stands, I can tell you that one of the deficiencies he cited, I believe, was the lack of an adequate chemical library, where within a year or two after Flexner did his report, if you will, the chemistry laboratory was upgraded at Leonard, and that wonderful hospital was built. So I've often wondered if Flexner had come perhaps 2 years later, if we would have had Leonard for a little longer, you see. Now this is a question I'd like to answer too. Was there ever a serious attempt to reopen Leonard? And the answer is yes. I know of one such year 1923 and also in around 1930, but it just didn't happen. You know, the having a very small endowment was, you know, really a tough road to hoe, if you will. But the accomplishments and the contributions continue to this day because of those men.
So they took the investments, not only their economic capital, but also their intellectual and emotional capital, to sow into the communities what we needed to have. And that was considerable, thinking about the deficit that folks were coming out of and coming from, and that they still had the wherewithal to be able to establish these institutions. I know we keep reiterating this, but it is looking at us as having assets rather than always looking at the Black community as having all of these deficits.
Absolutely, yes.
So continue our journey. Thank you.
All right. One of my favorite people and favorite Leonard men is Dr. John A. Kinney Sr. Dr. Kinney was born in Charlottesville, Virginia, Albemarle County, the home of the University of Virginia. And he first matriculated at Hampton, in my alma mater, and then he decided to enter Shaw University, graduating in 1901, the same year as Dr. Cornelius Garland. Now, Kinney, and this allows us to speak of or about postgraduate education. Kinney did an internship at Howard University's Freedmen's Hospital. And from there, Dean Johnson, he was summoned by the man. And by that, I mean Dr. Booker T. Washington himself summoned our Dr. Kinney down to Tuskegee Institute to take over the Tuskegee Institute Hospital. And so he realized that a lot of the problems that the population had there were due to just a lack of understanding proper hygiene. You know, you had a lot of pinworms and hookworm and that kind of thing. And so he was able to educate them. And Dr. Kinney was such a brilliant man. We have to talk here about the fact that he was a Renaissance man too. Dr. Kinney turned things around there. They actually were able to build a new hospital, the John Andrew Hospital, Memorial Hospital, should say, a little later. And Dr. Kinney knew that postgraduate education was going to be necessary because, you see, our doctors had very few places where they could continue learning, if you will, through internships and residencies. And so he paved the way, and he brought also interns to Tuskegee Institute to continue their studies. Now, Kinney did something that was major in addition to simply bringing interns there. He developed what was known as the John Andrew clinical it was the John Andrew clinics, postgraduate clinics. And this particular program, if you will, lasted almost a month every summer. And you had the finest surgical demonstrations done by the finest Black and white surgeons from around the country. So what happened there was our Black physicians would travel there and spend a few weeks there learning these new procedures that were demonstrated, but moreover, the patient population actually were beneficiaries, if you will, because people traveled from Georgia and Alabama to be seen at the clinics. And so they treated thousands of people at no cost through those clinics. And there was nothing quite like that at the time, but John Kinney had the vision. And another thing I will add is this, and it's personal here too, because I am the author of his biographical entry for the African American National Biography, which is a collaborative publication between the Hutchins Center for African American History, African American Research at Harvard University and the Oxford University Press. So I've also authored the entries for several of these Leonard men. So it's personal. Time doesn't even permit how much he did, but I'll tell you a powerful story. When the government decided to build a veterans hospital for Blacks who were veterans of World War One, they decided to place it at Tuskegee. And here's where a problem ensued. Kenny and others believed that that particular veterans hospital should be staffed by Black physicians and Black nurses, okay? Because there was a nursing school there, and some of the powers that be did not, and some of the locals did not. They, for some reason, they were under the assumption that Blacks could not be good administrators. And so things got so bad, Dean Johnson, that on one occasion there was a caravan of maybe 100 cars with Klansmen that traveled by the school and trying to intimidate them. And later on, someone got word to Dr. Kenny that he needed to leave because they were coming for him. So he had to just up, if you will, and relocate. And he ended up with his family in New Jersey, where he founded the Kenny Memorial Hospital in honor of his late parents. And so when we talk about continuing education, and there's one more thing
Yes.
before we move on. Dr. Kenny was really the founding editor of the Journal of the National Medical Association. And so he was just huge as a historian, as a civil rights activist. And do you know, with the Kenny Hospital in New Jersey, he ended up just giving that to the city. And so he was an incredible man also. And I'll stop there.
Oh, there's so much more, like you said, to know, but it also illustrates the consequences and costs of white supremacy, that here he is having to uproot with his family and relocate, and that's a loss for the community that he was leaving, is a gain for the community he goes to, but to be forced to do so is some other part of the story. And so carrying the weight of that's like another kind of tax, so to speak, that Blacks had, and especially those who were professional and had all of these abilities. So let's move on a little bit and get to one of your other favorite, Leonard.
Absolutely. And I know that
Yes.
you all in the triangle know him well. And I'm so delighted that his great-granddaughter and great-great-granddaughter have penned their own book publication about him. Dr. A.M. Moore was born of a free family there in Rosendale, North Carolina. And he, of course, started to teach actually as a teenager. And he ended up matriculating at really at Shaw, but they pulled him into the medical program. And we're all beneficiaries of that. Dr. A.M. Moore would end up graduating in that second class of 1888. There was no class for 1887. And upon graduating, he set up shop in Durham, becoming the first Black doctor to set up a practice there. And I think many are familiar with the fact that Dr. Moore and others would go on to found the mighty North Carolina Mutual, and in the area known as Durham's little Hayti, if you will. And we can't mention him without mentioning people like Dr. James Shepard and others, and Mr. Merrick and the Spaldings. But I think this speaks to something that is very powerful. He wanted Black people to see what it was like to actually do business with a Black pharmacy and a pharmacist, if you will. So he actually helped to set up that first pharmacy over there also. I believe Dr. Shepard worked in it for a bit, but he was an incorporator also of what would become North Carolina Central University, if you will. And he just believed in education across the board. So he too was a Leonard man. And we could go to the next slide, please. I want to show the very first building. Now that's reportedly, I believe, the very first building, the Lincoln Hospital there in Durham. And this is a powerful story in that Washington Duke, for whom Duke University is named, wanted to honor formerly enslaved Blacks who were supportive, I guess you'd say, or he wanted to honor them, after the end of the Civil War, and he wanted to erect some type of monument to them. So Dr. Moore and others convinced Mr. Duke that a hospital would be more beneficial than a monument to people you thought were loyal. And so by God's grace, we got Lincoln Hospital. Again, we had a powerful nursing school. And I think this really speaks to the man that Dr. Moore was. Even though he was the head person, the superintendent, whatever you want to call it, from 1901 at its inception until roughly his death in 1923, he did not take a salary for that.
Mm.
And so again, where you have issues with not having, many Black doctors, these people got together in order to mitigate the effects of those inequities, to bring, people who could not only take care of you in a medical way, but also offer continuing education and bring the nursing students or nurses along.
And we have a kind of the iteration or legacy of this Lincoln Hospital and his work in Lincoln Community Health Center to this day. And so what was again sown early on is living with us and helping to be a part of addressing those social determinants of ill health that we face today as a community.
Mm-hmm.
Next, yes.
Yes. Also, one of my favorites, Dr. L.A. Scruggs. Again, he was a Virginian. He matriculated at Richmond Theological Institute prior to, again, that's the forerunner of Virginia Union University, prior to going to Shaw. And he was a graduate again of that very first class of 1886. Now, from there, he became the resident physician. So he was, there were many firsts, I should say, attributed to him. He worked there, and he was also granted a pharmacist license. So he worked at the Capitol Pharmacy down there in Raleigh with the Love brothers, who were graduates of the Leonard Pharmacy School. And this, I think, is a special tribute in that the health commissioner, who was, of course, one of the faculty members, attributed a decrease in the mortality of Blacks in large part to Dr. Scruggs. That speaks volumes. Now, Dr. Scruggs didn't stop there. Tuberculosis ravaged our communities. And so he ended up founding the Pickford Sanitarium, I should say, in Southern Pines in North Carolina. And so he too was a Renaissance man. And if you follow the Black women's club movement, people are familiar with people like Mary Church Terrell and others. However, Dr. Lawson in around 1890 or so realized that our women were under attack by the press, just so many negative things. So he sought to mitigate what was, the effects of that. What he decided to do was this. Dr. Scruggs decided to put out an all points bulletin asking people to submit biographical entries for a book that he was going to do that spoke to the extraordinary accomplishments of our women. And that is where we received, I should say, a very special book. It's a very long title, but it's Women of Distinction. And it was published in 1893 with the biographies of about 100 women. His wife and his mother he was, I guess, drawn to that because of the special women in his life, but also to mitigate what was happening in regards to our women in the press. So this man, again, was also extraordinary. He was born enslaved in 1857 and died in 1914. But I mean, what he did and his contributions still reverberate to this day.
This is such amazing work and so interesting. It also speaks to the quality of the education that these Leonard men received
Yes,
at Leonard Medical School. I mean,
yes,
that's to be able to do all of what they've done means they had to have a great foundation and a great.
absolutely.
So I'd like to know really quickly, were you able to see some of the curriculum that they had at the time? Did that come?
Yes, absolutely. I usually include that in my presentations, but
Oh, so
today,
we're gonna have to have you come back with that.
oh yes, because it is believed that Leonard initiated or organized the first 4-year graded curriculum in the country. So we use that qualifier graded because it means that classes built subsequently upon previous classes. And as such, some of these men were so brilliant that they graduated in 3 years instead of 4.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And another thing I'd like to dispel is this: many of these men went on for postgraduate study, not only overseas, but to Ivy League schools like Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania. And so, the brilliance persisted, absolutely, and they were well respected. I this is There's some things I'm saving for the documentary, but let me whet your appetite. I have
Please do.
I have spoken to descendants whose uh, Leonard ancestors were so gifted as surgeons that they operated under the cloak of darkness on white patients at white hospitals.
Mm.
Absolutely. And I mean, the
Mhm.
stories of the half has never been told. I get goosebumps when I hear these stories because, these are the things you can't get in books, but they lived these things, you see. Absolutely.
This is
And many of
great.
them even devised new techniques, if you will. Absolutely. Hmm.
Mm. See, there we go. We like for you to continue. I think, do you, is, yes.
Okay, I'll speed through so we'll have time for questions. I wanted to bring in one lady who did matriculate but did not graduate from the medical school. Mrs. Fleming was born enslaved in 1862 in Florida. She ended up teaching early on after freedom came, and she matriculated at Shaw University, graduating nearly #1 in her class, as I understand it, in 1885 as a part of the St. Cemetery. Seminary, because at that time Shaw had this training uh, program for those who wanted to enter, the missionary field, if you will. So she actually ministered to people in the Congo and came back. She was, she did have a couple of bouts of illness, but she actually matriculated at the Leonard Medical School where she took the anatomy and physiology. She didn't complete it, but she did go on to become the first known Black woman to enter and graduate from the women's uh, medical college there in Pennsylvania. And I think she graduated waited in about 1895, and she has the distinction of reportedly being the first Black lady who was purposely sent by the Baptists, Women's Baptist Foreign Mission, I believe, Society. Okay.
Fascinating.
Mhm. All right, this is the last one. He's one of my favorite Leonard men too. Dr. Hughes was born in 1870. He graduated first from Virginia Normal and Industrial Institute. We know that as Virginia State University today. And then he went to Leonard, the Leonard Medical School, and he won the majority of the prizes for the year that he graduated, and that was 1897. From there, he interned at Howard University's Freedmen's Hospital. Uh, I think Dr. Daniel Hale Williams was still there. He actually was a surgical resident there. And this man, Dean Johnson, was one of the most skilled surgeons that Leonard ever produced. I have uncovered stories where he quietly, under the cloak of darkness, did surgical demonstrations for white physicians, even. But Dr. Hughes made history, and this allows us to talk about the COVID situation now, lastly, and that Spanish influenza of 1918 that you mentioned. In Richmond, they set up an emergency hospital for whites and blacks. The blacks patients were relegated to the basement. So Mrs. Maggie Walker and others prevailed upon Governor Westmoreland Davis to set up an emergency hospital for blacks at the Baker Elementary School for blacks. Okay, who was chosen to be the person in chief? Our Dr. Hughes. So in that particular hospital ran like a well-oiled engine, so much so that it was universally lauded. So you had a Leonard man at the very top and a Leonard man who was the assistant chief of medicine at that particular one. So I wanted to mention Dr. Hughes because he was extraordinary, and you will be hearing more about him. And I yield back my time. I think that may be the last one. Okay, yes.
Yes.
I wanted to make sure we had time for a question. Okay.
And I think that we do have a question about the law school. I know that you had mentioned it a little bit, if there is anyone doing research on the law school as well.
Yes, I think there's been quite a bit on that, and I dived into it myself because I think the contributions need to be illuminated. You know, people in North Carolina may know more about that, but that school, I think, maybe graduated perhaps no more than 50. But when we look at the very first graduate, Edwin Austin or E.A. Johnson, who he was a Renaissance man in and of himself. He graduated from there. He later became dean of the law school, but he took it upon himself to actually write a school book, a textbook for Black students so that they could see themselves in the history of America. Now, we know about Carter G. Woodson, you know, talking about this later, but our E.A. Johnson did this in around 1890 or so. And so we also had Rafael O'Hara, who graduated from the Leonard Medical School, where his father, I think it was James O'Hara, served in Congress from the Black Second in North Carolina. So it is believed that the father O'Hara and Rafael O'Hara, who graduated from the Leonard Law School, are believed to be the first two-generation Black practitioners in all of North Carolina.
Thank you so much. One other person I would like for you to mention just briefly, because I can point folks to that, and that is Manassas M.T. Pope, Dr. Manassas T. Pope. If you could give us a few tidbits, since he is so close to Shaw in terms of his house as a house museum. Yes,
now I am blessed to have had the privilege to enter and tour the house years ago when it was under the foundation. Mr. Manassas T. Pope was born free, or a free family in Northampton County in North Carolina, and he graduated from that first class of 1886. He was a civil rights activist. He ran for office, and he just promoted the need for education. These people also promoted the need to have our own businesses. And so he too was a Renaissance man. And, you know, I can't wait to get back down there again and really be able to tour the house again. Absolutely. So I went down there and I took a cameraman with me because, you know, I started doing this years ago, you know, with my own pennies, but you have to capture people when you can. Absolutely. So he's just another incredible man. And so were his daughters and his wife. Yes.
Yes. And in fact, that's another question that came in the chat. When is the documentary going to be shown? People are waiting to see it right now.
Well, actually, you know, the thing that usually slows things down like this is money. So if you're interested in sowing a seed, if you will, or you know, I have nonprofit, I have a fiscal agent that, you know, will allow people to be able to write these things off, because I now have a grant. I was granted a grant last year for something that's different or outside of this. So if people are interested in it, you know, we can make it happen because it's a passion project. It's going to happen, but because I'm continuously working on it and filming people. Absolutely. So if I can do that without funding, imagine how fast that publication can move with funding. you see. Mhm.
And with that, I just want to say thank you so much for giving us your time and your energy. But I do want to yield to our president, Paulette Dillard, and have her give us a few words to send us off.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dean Johnson and Elvatrice. Thank you. This has been an amazing conversation around the incredible graduates of Leonard Medical School.
Thank you, Dr.
And you know, and the fact that the governor of North Carolina, along with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, designated Leonard Medical School to be recognized for Black History Month. And so the governor chose 5 of Leonard's graduates to recognize by way of a publication, website mention. And those 5 graduates of Leonard Medical School, Dr. Manassas T. Pope, Dr. Lawrenson A. Scruggs, Dr. John T. Williams, Dr. Aaron McDuffie Moore, and Dr. William G. Torrance. And so that just, and your discussion today highlighted the incredible contributions these individuals made that graduated from Leonard Medical School. And we are so happy that you agreed to lift these folks up so that others will know about the incredible work of Leonard Medical graduates to the well-being of individuals in our nation, Black and white. And we just want to, again, thank you. And we'll be in touch about how we can assist in making this documentary happen, and hope that you'll be back soon so that we can learn more about the incredible graduates of Leonard Medical School. And we hope that our students that are on the webinar today learned some new and exciting things about what has taken place in the past at Shaw and what can happen in the future at Shaw. And so again, we are so delighted to have had you here today, and thank you very much, Dean Johnson, for coordinating and moderating this excellent program.
Thank you, President Dillard. I'd love to come back. I could lecture for 8 hours without notes. So if you give me the time, we can. Do we have time for one quick, another powerful story?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. This allows me to bring in the pharmacy students, pharmacy school graduates. Dr. George Rolifert became the first Black doctor to pass the boards in New Jersey. And he was the class of 1888, Leonard Medical School. And in talking about the lifting as we climb, once William Vick graduated from Leonard in 1897, he brought him up to run his pharmacy. Mr. Vick took the pharmacy boards, please listen very carefully. Mr. Vick took the pharmacy boards with about 42 to 43 other white people, and he blew it away. Our Mr. Vick scored the highest of over 40 test takers to pass the boards in New Jersey, thereby becoming the first known licensed pharmacist in New Jersey. So there are myriad stories like this. For what I understand, Mr. Vick scored a perfect 100. These are the stories. And what I would like to convey to the young people is, if these people who were born enslaved and born in the wake of freedom can go on to start institutions and pioneering businesses and hospitals and organizations, if they can do that, you're limitless as to what you can achieve today with faith, faith-based collectivism, and hard work. And I'll stop right there because I can go for hours when we talk about Leonard. But thank you, Dr. Dillard, and the student body and faculty and staff, and Dean Johnson. Thank you all, and President Dillard, for allowing me to share a little bit of my research.
Absolutely. On that note, I want to thank everyone for your attention and your presence today and being encouraged. If you can't be encouraged by this, I don't know what would be. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Be safe as you travel, and we will see you with the next Learned Conversation. Stay tuned.
Thank you.